we're finding that the regulator is becoming part of a health system conversation. Whereas in the past, not many people knew about regulation, right? And the important role that we play to ensure access. We're basically the first step in ensuring that a product can be accessible. So reliance is becoming quite an important lever to enable broader access to products, because then even when you're not a well-capacitated regulator, you can rely on one that is well-capacitated to do the assessment, and you then rely on the work that they've done. And I am of the firm view that there's a lot more that can be done between the public sector and the private sector to ensure sustainable health systems and programs. And in essence, I mean, what industry wants from regulators is some level of certainty, right? To say, if I give you my product today, how long would it take? If it takes you 200 days, I want that certainty that indeed in 200 days, you will have an outcome for me.
Welcome to the Health Equity Podcast, where we bring experts from around the world to share their work and their vision on how we can engage the pharmaceutical industry to bridge gaps for 80% of the world's population living in low and middle income countries. Today's episode is part of our Health Equity Through Her Lens campaign, where we bring women leaders who are working on the interface of access to healthcare globally to share their work. Today, I'm joined by my guest, Dr. Boitumelo Semete, otherwise known as Tumi. She's the CEO of South Africa's Health Products Regulatory Authority and the chair of the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Initiative. Welcome, Tumi.
Thank you so much for having me, Jay.
So, Tumi, tell me a little bit about yourself. What made you get involved in medicines regulation?
So, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because it was never planned. So, I mean, my background is in research, and I spent many years as a senior researcher in South Africa. Did my postdoc, and just before I joined the regulator, I was heading up a research division at a science institute. Mm-hmm. But what made me interested in the role was that as we were developing technologies, I mean, at the time, my background is in nanotechnology, drug delivery systems. And I remember during our R&D, when we were doing our preclinical trials, we really wanted to engage with the regulator to understand what the regulatory pathway will be, because this was a new technology. I mean, at the time, there weren't even any approved nano-based drugs. Mm-hmm. And we really battled to reach the regulator. And we saw that regulation could be a barrier. So when I was approached for this role, I thought, well, maybe I can do a little bit in changing that, right? And make regulation more of an enabler. Because there's just so many innovations that are taking place in my country and across the world that it would be great if they could reach the patient. And that's really why I'm here.
In our recent research, we found that there's not a lot of good practices when you think about how the pharmaceutical industry is bringing products to low and middle income countries. In fact, almost half of the products that we've analyzed are not registered in countries that have the highest disease burden. And upper middle income countries tend to have 5 times more likelihood of registration. So without registration of products in markets itself, access is heavily limited downstream itself. So the role of the regulator, the role of registration, the role of ensuring quality products is becoming more and more important in order for us to bridge these health equity gaps. So tell us a little bit about some of the trends that are evolving in the African continent when it comes to what are regulatory authorities such as yours working on, and how does that help bridge those gaps in access to medicine?
Yeah, I mean, you're spot on, right? So if we take, for example, COVID as an example, right? Low middle income countries got the vaccines a lot later. Mm-hmm. And even the regulators in those countries, we got the dossiers a lot later. And when you actually engage with the industry to understand why that is so, the reasons that you get is that our timelines are long. Mm-hmm. And really, why are they long? They're long because we don't always have the capacity. If it's there, it's very limited. So therefore, then it takes you longer to assess a dossier that it would take an EMA, for example, a few months to do. And so issues of building capacity are becoming quite important. Mm-hmm. That even if you don't have it in country, at least have it in the region and be able to access it. The second point is that many of our systems are not, and requirements are not harmonized. And so there's a lot taking place around regulatory harmonization at a continental level for my continent, wherein we're saying instead of an applicant having to submit their dossier to 55 different countries, we can actually have a single requirement for the continent that is harmonized, and they then get a continental authorization. And when they go to the respective countries, the countries can then recognize that. So there's clearly a recognition for the need for us to harmonize so that we get quicker access to products.
And how does it help some of the smaller countries, especially those that have not managed to get enough capacity to be built in and may not be even large enough markets for the pharmaceutical industry?
Exactly. I mean, you raise an important point that some markets are just too small for pharma to spend so much time and effort of putting together a dossier for that specific market. And so one of the, I would call it trends maybe, is reliance, wherein when a pharmaceutical company submits a dossier to a large market like South Africa, for example, once South Africa has authorized that product, you then have countries like Botswana, like Lesotho and Swaziland that will then rely on an assessment done by South Africa, and they then register the product within the shortest amount of time. Some of them take about a month to register the product. So reliance is becoming quite an important lever to enable broader access to products, because then even when you're not a well-capacitated regulator, you can rely on one that is well-capacitated to do the assessment, and you then rely on the work that they've done. You still have autonomy, you make the decision, but you've considered work done by others. And I mean, even for countries like South Africa, we rely on assessments by the US FDA, by the European Medicines Agency, by Health Canada, TGA. So it's really become common practice for the not so well-resourced regulators to rely on others.
And how far are we from this level of reliance? I mean, is this something that's already in practice today? Or are there different levels of maturity of the different regulatory agencies?
So there's definitely different levels of maturity. I mean, you get regulators that, so what you're seeing is that regulators that are not so well-resourced, they embrace that, right? A lot quicker than those that are better resourced, like South Africa, who wants to do a full assessment.
Right.
So again, it's a change in mindset. Because imagine, Jay, you've been doing an assessment, full assessment, say, for 20 years. And now you need to trust someone else,
right?
Someone you haven't met, someone you trust that they're using, international standards. But truth be told, you don't quite know, right? So the issue of trust still comes through quite a lot. But we're seeing that there's a lot of advances. There's a lot of improvement in the right direction, particularly as we start to collaborate with some of the bigger agencies. Our team become part of some of the collaborative reviews. And so they build that trust within the reference agency.
Are you starting to see a response already from the multinational and the local pharmaceutical companies?
Yes, yes. No, certainly we are. I mean, some of them, when they submit their applications, they actually indicate that they would like for us to rely on either an EMA assessment or US FDA, and they provide us then with the documents that are required.
So tell me a little bit of whether you've seen specific examples of good practices where changes in regulation or changes in activities of the pharmaceutical industry has actually helped to bridge these gaps in access.
So I'm going to go back to COVID again, because as devastating as it was, it affected many people in many different ways. But there were benefits of having gone through that pandemic as a global regulatory community and as industry, really. What we found was that there's a lot more engagement between the regulator and industry. So many of us have got very structured mechanisms of how we engage with industry, what we communicate, the kind of feedback that we get. But even more so at a health system level, we're finding that the regulator is becoming part of a health system conversation. Whereas in the past, not many people knew about regulation, right? And the important role that we play to ensure access. We're basically the first step in ensuring that a product can be accessible. So we're now integral in many of their health systems. And with that, we see new ways of partnering. So for example, in my country, in South Africa, during the pandemic, we had a partnership between the government and private sector. And private sector included pharma, where they would share data on product availability, where they would, offer support, offer some of their resources. And so I do think that there are learnings in there around new ways of working, new ways of partnering. And we can't have this podcast this time around with me being African and the impact that the US government stop work orders has had in our countries, right? And again, another crisis, but a crisis that gives us an opportunity to reflect and say, how do we start to work differently? How do we start to build sustainability in our programs? And I am of the firm view that there's a lot more that can be done between the public sector and the private sector to ensure sustainable health systems and programs, because the resources are there. For example, in my country, the resources are there, but it requires that we work together to ensure access to the products.
And are you seeing a different response in terms of the growth of local manufacturers and how they rely more on regulatory developments in the continent? And does that mean that there's going to be a very large number of pharmaceutical companies that are also growing in the continent?
I don't know if I could say large, but there'll certainly be a significant increase in the number of pharmaceutical companies we have. I mean, a big focus now is around vaccines and biologicals. But certainly, with the growth of the local industry, it does require that we work differently, even as regulators. Yes, not compromising our requirements and our standards, but a lot of our regulatory practices always assumed that a product is imported into our countries. And now that it will be manufactured, it means that even from a skill set, you need a lot more of those skills available in country to support the local industry. Because what you want as a national regulator is that any product manufactured locally that is then exported, you don't want it to be compromised at any level. No. You want that confidence in your regulatory system. The second point that we're seeing is that, again, we are finding that we have to wear a hat of an enabler, so handhold some of these companies, because some of them have not put together a dossier. Right. You can imagine they entered into an agreement with another country, with another company. They would be provided the dossier, which they share with us. Now they have to do all of that together on their own. And so we have to handhold them a bit. And there comes then a point where we are the police. So straddling between these two roles can be rather difficult. Right. But I do think that as we morph as regulators, it will be required of us to do that more and more until our industry is at a point where they are able to navigate the regulatory landscape a lot better.
Right. And in terms of quality, there, one of the biggest issues that people face all around the world, especially in low and middle income countries, is the availability of poor quality medicines in the marketplace, right? And the marketplace can be literally markets, sometimes over the counter, and you really have issues on availability of good quality products around the continent. What are some of the regulatory policies and practices that are now emerging in the continent that is really helping that field along?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of our big problems across the continent. We even have working groups focusing on how we term it, which is substandard and falsified products. And as I say, you see it across the continent. And so some of the mechanisms include, when the products are imported, for those that are at the ports of entry, we've got scanners and analytical tools to test the product as it comes in. And we can then stop it there if it's substandard. We also, many of us are now implementing barcoding so that we can then again track and trace, where this product has been tampered with, etc. So tamper-proof is some of the things that we're putting in place. And then lastly, there is a mechanism coordinated by the WHO for substandard and falsified products. And we're piloting this mechanism, which basically requires that you work with a range of other law enforcement stakeholders, because you can't deal with this alone as a regulator. So we work with the police services, with the pharmacy council, etc. So there's a whole working group that says, how do we tackle this as a country and as a region? Maybe lastly, if I could also mention that what also contributes to the challenge is that our borders are quite porous, on the continent. So we need to ensure that we maintain integrity of what comes into the country and what leaves our country. So there's a lot of efforts going into this area.
And including some level of data sharing, right? So if any particular country notices that there are substandard or falsified medicines in the market, when there's more harmonization and coordination, you can quickly inform others that this is happening.
Absolutely.
And prevent that it is reaching people all around the world.
Absolutely. So we're doing that. And we've got the support of the WHO. So they've got a platform that they've made available where we can issue all of these notices. And we then are able to act on it. And those countries that may be affected, we can get together and say, what's our joint or collaborative strategy to respond to that issue.
So let's move into an area of artificial intelligence, right? How do regulators look at the possibilities that AI actually opens up when it comes to managing multiple data points, surveillance, evaluating dossiers from multiple pharmaceutical companies? Is there a particular response or activity around AI?
Certainly. I think none of us can ignore AI. If you do so, you do so at your own peril.
Right.
Because industry is using it, right? Whether it's in their manufacturing processes, used a lot in medical devices. So there's that one element where we need to say, how do we regulate an industry that utilizes AI? So you're regulating AI as part of a process or as a device. But another big opportunity is where you then utilize AI internally as a regulator to drive efficiency, to drive data analysis, to drive access to all this data that we sit with. And so what we're doing as SAHPRA is we're integrating it, and we've got a few proof of concepts that we're working on now, wherein instead of having, a human being do a technical screening of a dossier. And what that means is you look at the dossier and you say, is all the information there? Is it in the quality that I want? Does it have the data that I want?
Right.
Instead of someone going through that checklist, you just put it in the tool. And the tool very quickly, within a matter of minutes, will then give you the responses and say, here, this is there, this is not there. So it drives efficiency quite significantly. The other area is around pharmacovigilance, wherein, again, because pharmaceuticals is global, there could be adverse drug reactions that are reported in Sweden that we may not necessarily be aware of. But when you're using AI, you can actually access multiple sources of data, and it enables your decision making. So you're accessing data a lot quicker than you having to go and look up for it. But even in addition to having to access data that's external, internally, we sit with a lot of data. I mean, you can imagine, we've been in place since the 1960s. So we sit with a lot of data.
Yeah.
But if you can't utilize it and be able even to rely on it, it's rather useless, right? So we're using these tools to say, look within our database. Is there a similar API? Is there the same API we've looked at us in the same dosage form, even if it could be for a different indication, and which site is it manufactured? And if all of those are similar, you're then able to even rely on your prior work. So it will significantly drive efficiency. So we've got those proof of concepts that are taking place. But not just SAHPRA is doing that. We've got, I think, about 4 other African regulators that are piloting different tools. And our intention is that towards the end of the year, at a scientific regulators meeting, we will share what we've been able to do with these tools and how then others can also access them.
And does that require a large amount of investment in your regulatory systems?
It
right?
does.
So who's going to pay for that? Who's going to drive that change?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a lot of the projects are currently grant funded, but for many of us, I can talk for SAHPRA, there is a recognition that we want to be able to pay for this ourselves.
Right.
So as we do these proof of concept and pilots, we're actually developing a business case of let's look at the amount of time that it saves us. Let's look at the financial resources that it saves us, and when can we see our return on investment. So we are having conversations with our finance team to say, this is where we will need to invest. There are times when I've been having conversations around, instead of filling certain roles, if that job can be done by a tool, AI tool, why not do so? Why not consider that? But you will always require a human being to do the final review and give the final, outcome. I think we're not at a point where we can trust machines that fully.
No.
In regulation, we'll always have that. But then what it does is it frees up space for your team to do then the more, advanced and very intense regulatory review than some of the mundane tasks, so to say.
So you basically, you're saying that the regulatory agencies are at a point of quite a large number of innovative steps in growth. Many are in different stages of growth, but at the end, it pays off extremely well when it comes to both the economies of scale, the availability of medicines and better health products entering markets, and the downstream effects on economies and societies in that sense, right? So
Absolutely.
It's probably universally recognized that this is a good thing to do.
Absolutely. I can't agree with you more. And I mean, even just from an accuracy perspective, right? One of the proof of concepts that we did, the tool was a lot more accurate than our actual assessors.
Wow.
Right. So you can have a very high level of confidence in some of the screening you do. But also it will drive improved access to health products. And in essence, I mean, what industry wants from regulators is some level of certainty. Right? Yeah. To say, if I give you my product today, how long would it take? If it takes you 200 days, I want that certainty that indeed in 200 days, you will have an outcome from me. And because we're resource constrained, many of us in low middle income countries, we aren't always able to meet that time frame, which is highly frustrating for industry, because then they can't do their product, plan for their product launches, for their artwork and all of those things, right? So that unpredictability and uncertainty is certainly negative for them. But once you can utilize these tools to get a lot of the legwork done, you would be able to get to a level where you are able to give some level of certainty.
I mean, we've actually identified in 2014 Access Medicine Index that a number of the large pharmaceutical companies were investing in the African continent, setting up offices, investing in research and development. In recent years, we've seen a large number of the multinationals actually leaving the African continent for economic reasons, for strategic reasons, for quite a number of different reasons on that. Do you think that all this regulatory development is too late to ensure that innovative products are available in the African continent? Or do you think it's possible to sort of re-engage the industry to say, we have a market, we have systems in place now, we need your products, you need us as customers, let's partner?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's late at all, because you will always be there as low middle income countries. And for some therapeutic areas, we will be a lucrative market for industry. But also you've got industry that's looking, even though they may be exiting, but they're partnering in different ways, that they may exit a country, but actually transfer their whole portfolio to a local entity to better manage, because they're either focusing more on innovative medicines, or they are consolidating around a certain therapeutic areas. So what we're seeing is, while it may look like an exit, but it's actually more consolidation. And I do believe that once we can improve our regulatory systems, we will actually see more of the innovative products coming into our countries, because the health need is there. And you've got companies that genuinely want to contribute to a better health system and better health outcomes. Right. And those are the companies that will then still operate in our markets in whichever form, and make sure that there is introduction of those therapeutic areas.
So what's your message to some of the largest companies around the world, whether they're multinational, big pharmaceutical companies with research-based backgrounds, or whether they're multinational generic companies, or even the local companies, right? What's your message in how they need to engage with regulators, with the continent, in order for us to bridge some of these gaps in access?
So, I mean, my message would be that there's a lot of developments on the African continent. I think over the last 5 years or so, we have seen significant improvements in our continent. We now have the African Medicine Agency that's been established, which is geared to look at these complex drugs. And with that in place, we will see a much more accelerated time frame. And so our really message is to say, Africa continues to require the health products that industry provides. We are faced with similar challenges, health challenges, maybe not at the same scale, but know that regulators are doing what they can within their mandate to ensure that they are effective in how we operate, to ensure that we're harmonized. And all of this is with the intention of improving access to healthcare. And then lastly is to say, we're open to engaging with industry. We have platforms wherein we can engage with industry in a very formalized, very transparent mechanism. And we can then share with you what are some of our developments. We can share with you how we can even partner as regulators and industry.
So how does the African Medicines Agencies work with the European Medicines Agency? Are there a lot of collaborations at the North-South level?
Certainly. I mean, the EMA has been a great partner of the AMA, the African Medicine Agency, really from its inception. They've made some commitments, even publicly known, that they want to support. And it's a collaboration that's appreciated a lot because, I mean, this year they're celebrating their 30th year. And there's a lot for us to learn from them. There's certainly similarities in terms of the centralized review that we want to do, how some products will go to the AMA and countries will then recognize that. But there are also some differences. Again, the EU laws can be very different to the AU laws in terms of member states still have that autonomy. And so while we recognize what's similar and what's different, I think from a regulatory perspective, there's a lot that we can glean from cooperating with the EMA to strengthen the AMA. The second point I'd raise is that, as I mentioned earlier, pharmaceuticals and health is global, right? And there are instances that we may even rely on the work done by the EMA as the African Medicines Agency. An important point is also how they're structured in terms of their governance boards, how they engage and interact with the different member states. Again, we've not done that before. So there are some key learnings in how they're organized, in how their governance structures are that we can certainly borrow from. We now have a DG that's appointed for the AMA, and certainly I think this partnership will help her a lot in setting up this agency of ours.
So there's a lot of new technologies that is in research and development. And we've seen over the years there are newer and newer technologies, whether it's mRNA technologies, you mentioned your own background in nanotechnologies, and obviously things like radioligand therapies can make a huge impact in patients' lives, especially in resource-limited settings. How do regulators look at this, look at the development of newer and newer technologies in sort of their evolution of setting up regulatory systems and incentives?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's quite important to South Africa because we do have quite a strong R&D environment compared to some of the countries in the West, but very strong research organizations and universities. And linked to that, we've got a very strong clinical trial community. So invariably, you will have some of these technologies undergo clinical trial in our country, which means that as a regulator, we will be faced with that technology even before market authorization. And so this is so embedded in our strategy that what we do is we encourage our team that we always have to keep abreast of these developments, but also because we participate in many kind of global regulatory fora, such as ICH, such as the IMDRF for medical devices, the International Medical Devices Fora. We then are able to borrow from what others have put together through those platforms and adapt it to our local context. Mm-hmm. So, for example, one of the areas that we are focusing on is around advanced medicinal therapies. This includes stem cells, etc. And we already have, I think in the last I checked, we had about 5 clinical trials that were using these advanced medicinal therapies. So we don't have the luxury of sitting back and say, we'll deal with, the business as usual. We are seeing a lot of these technologies come through. I mean, one that's quite exciting is around bacteriophages. Mm-hmm. With AMR being an issue and, resistance, etc. There's a lot of research taking place in South Africa around utilizing bacteriophages. At the moment, we don't have guidelines, but we've noted that, the EMA has published something on bacteriophages. And so we're looking at that and say, how do we then adapt? Because we understand that we may not necessarily have all the know-how to develop and design these guidelines from scratch. So we cooperate and we collaborate with others, but we always adapt it to our context.
We've called upon the pharmaceutical industry to actually be more inclusive of patients all around the world, especially in high burden disease areas, to make sure that they're included in clinical studies, so that eventually these products are also registered and available in those countries itself, right? So as regulators, do you support that? And how do you support that?
Yeah, no, we do, certainly. And I think many of us regulators, wherein there are studies going on in countries where are intending to do studies, or where there's at least a sizable research community, we are engaging with our research communities to say we're there to help. So one of the things that we've done is, and I think you could see it as part of building capacity, is that we would have a pre-submission meeting, particularly with those innovators that have probably never submitted a clinical trial application. And they would come to us and say, this is the preclinical data that I have. These are the clinical endpoints I would like to have. This is the design. Have you got any feedback for us? So I'm finding that we're doing that more and more lately, which for me is encouraging, because then it says we are accessible for those early conversations, and those early conversations could influence development quite significantly, whether someone proceeds with a study or not. And I do believe that more and more of that needs to happen. One of the areas that we're thinking about also is that how do we become part of the research agenda in a country, health systems agenda, because once we are integral in that, we would even be able to share, what are some of the regulatory gaps that we're seeing with health products, and researchers and clinical trial, investigators could then even design studies with that in mind. So there is a role for regulators to be integral in a health system conversation as well as a research and development conversation.
Thank you, Tumi, for your time today and for all your insights.
Thank you for having me. It was quite insightful, even for me. When you're sharing your thoughts, they play back, right, for yourself. So this was quite fun. Thank you.
In today's episode, you've heard about how African regulators are working towards harmonizing different systems in the continent to bridge gaps in health access and health equity. They've talked a bit about collaborative efforts, working with the World Health Organization, working with the European Medicines Agencies, and working with the pharmaceutical industry, both multinational and local, in bridging those gaps for access, the chronic gaps that have been in place for years. You've also heard about innovative solutions and the use of how regulators look at improving efficiencies using AI. So there's a lot of solutions that you can hear about, and I hope that everyone can engage on these particular issues and learn more. Thank you again for listening.